going to record in a while. I'm getting hate mail for not recording, so we're going to record. Okay. You have to give the people what they want. Democracy. Okay. Okay, chapter 4. I'm reading like I said, in the art scroll, it's page 307. I'm going to read it from the Metzudah translation on the screen. Maybe a little bit different, but we're trying to read in the same book. The Hebrew is the same, that I can guarantee you. The English may be a little bit different. Okay, so here we go. Moses answered and said, behold, they will not believe me, and they will not heed my voice. Ki yomru, here they're saying, but they will say, or because they will say, for they will say, the Lord has not appeared to you. So basically, Moshe says it's all well and good. Till now, Moshe didn't want to go to Pharaoh. Finally, Moshe, maybe he's convinced to go to Pharaoh. But before you go to Pharaoh, you have to go to the Jewish people. And you have to convey the message to the Jewish people. So Moshe says the Jewish people are not going to listen to me. So this is a powerful thing. Could you go to speak to Pharaoh on behalf of the Jewish people if the Jewish people don't believe in you? No. Right? Before you could be the leader of the Jews have to buy in. Right? Because seemingly, who cares about the Jews? Go to Pharaoh. Tell the Pharaoh that God wants the people to go, and Pharaoh will let the people go. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But what are the Jews a party? No, but if Moshe is representing the Jews have to believe. And if the Jews don't believe, it's not going to work. So he says the Jews are not going to believe. Now we have to understand, what does that mean? Why won't the Jewish people believe? So we'll put that aside, but that's a question we want to address. So what does God do in response? So, and the Lord said to him, what is this in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, God tells Moshe, cast it to the ground. And he cast it to the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it. So it's a serpent, and Moshe is afraid. That's part of the plot, probably. Moshe is afraid of the serpent. Okay, so he runs away. Verse 4. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch forth your hand and take hold of its tail. So Moses stretched forth his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand. What a trick. He has the staff, he throws it onto the floor, it becomes a serpent. Moshe is afraid, Moshe runs away. God says, grab the serpent by the tail. Now, I'm not so good with animals, but I know that's a very bad idea. If you're going to grab a serpent, you probably know what you do. If you know what you're doing and you know how to grab a serpent, probably best to grab it by its head, right? If you grab it by its tail, then it's going to come and attack you. But Moshe is afraid of the serpent. So now God says, right, in verse 4, stretch forth your hand and take hold of its tail. Like I say, don't try this at home, right? It's a very bad idea. So Moses stretched forth his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand. Okay. So now we have a magic trick. So what does God say? In order that they believe that the Lord, the God of their forefathers, has appeared to you, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So in other words, Moshe says the people are not going to believe me. So God says, okay, here's the sign. You'll do this sign, and the people are going to believe you. So it happened here. I guess you can reproduce the sign in front of the Jewish people. And that's what it's going to say later. That's what he does. Okay. One sign is not enough. Why not? Okay, I don't know. But one sign is not enough. And will be a second sign. So again, this may support the concept that there's a philosophical point being conveyed here, but maybe not. Maybe just one magic trick. You don't want to have a one-trick pony, right? You're not that good if you can only do one trick. Maybe you need multiple tricks. So God gives now another sign. What's the next sign? Verse 6, right? So here in the art scroll, it would be on page 309. Verse 6, and the Lord said further to him, now put your hand into your bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom, and he took it out, and behold, his hand was leprous like snow. So his hand is healthy, puts it into his hand, now it's leprous. Leprous is tzarat, but tzarat is the form of leprosy. It's not really leprosy, but okay, it's a skin discoloring, and we know from later in the book of Leviticus that it's white. So now it's white. So it's leprous like snow. And he said, put your hand back into your bosom. And he put his hand back into his bosom. And when he took it out of his bosom, it had become again like the rest of his flesh. So now it's healthy. Okay, now we have two signs. You could put his hand in his bosom and it becomes white, and takes it out, it becomes healthy again. Okay, beautiful. Says God, and it will come to pass that if they do not believe you and they do not heed the voice of the first sign, they will believe the voice of the last sign. Okay, now it's interesting. In biblical Hebrew, last doesn't mean last, because you're going to see in a minute there's another sign. Last means the later. Acharon, in modern Hebrew, acharon means the last. But in biblical Hebrew, achar could be after. In other words, if they don't hear the first sign, they'll listen to the later sign. Here they translate the last sign. How does their art scroll translate verse 8? That'll be interesting. They will believe the voice of the latter sign. Okay, good. Art scroll translates latter sign. Mitsuda translates last sign. So it's interesting. So in modern Hebrew, the Mitsuda wins, because in modern Hebrew, acharon is the last. And it also in biblical Hebrew, acharon means the last, but it doesn't have to mean last. It could mean achar, because the root word achar is after. Usually the last is after the previous ones. But in this case, it's clear that it's not the last sign, because in the next verse, there'll be another sign. And that's why the art scroll translates latter sign, right? The end of verse 8, because this is the latter sign. Okay, verse 9, if 2 is not enough, and it will come to pass, if they do not believe either of these 2 signs, and they do not heed your voice, you shall take of the water of the Nile and spill it upon the dry land, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land. This is a trick that you're familiar with from the 10 plagues. The first plague later is that the water turns to blood. So apparently this is not as well known, but apparently Moshe performs the trick earlier. For the Jewish people, he has a third sign that he could take water from the Nile, pour it on the earth, and it turns to blood, and that's the third sign. And then that's it. And that's the signs. Now, verse 10, Moshe has an additional resistance. The additional resistance in verse 10 is a different problem. In other words, till now, is the Jewish people are not going to believe me. Moshe now doesn't raise that resistance anymore. Why not? Because God addresses that resistance. God says, here you have 3 signs, so now they're going to believe you. Verse 10, we have other problems. Moshe says, I can't speak. That's verse 10. So we'll get to verse 10 later. But I'm just trying to show that Moshe raises this as a resistance. God addresses this problem, that the Jewish people are not going to believe me, and gives him 3 signs. And now that Moshe has these signs, he has to acknowledge that, if I do these signs, that people are going to believe. So now I have to, but now there's different resistance, and that's verse 10, and that we will address later. But so far, that's the story. And again, the first question we want to ask is, what exactly does Moshe think the Jewish people are not going to believe? That's one issue. And the other issue is it simply that these 3 magic tricks are just simply that, you have superhuman, God spoke to you, and therefore God gives you these tricks, and therefore you must be a true prophet? Or the way many of the commentaries want to read is that these signs, it's a sign, what he calls it a ot. He says ot, right? If you look at verse 8, for example, it will come to pass that if you do not believe you, they do not heed the voice of the first sign. Ot is a sign. Sign is a message, right? We say Shabbat is a sign. Tefillin is a sign, right? It's an action that represents a deeper philosophical point. We rest on Shabbat as a sign that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So ot, a sign, means that there's a deeper story. So now the commentaries seek to figure out what is a deeper story. What do these signs represent? So that's what we have to try to unpack. Go ahead, Dr. John.
It's a strange question, but I'm a strange kind of guy. The question is this: do Kabbalists make anything of the fact, given your talk about magic today, that the most famous magician in history was a Jew, Harry Houdini, whose name was Weiss and his father was a rabbi, and he's the biggest magician in the history?
Wow, yeah. So that's a good question about magic. What do we believe about magic? Is it true? Is it not true? That's a broader discussion. In true Jewish fashion, that itself is up for debate. So there's no easy answers.
Okay.
Maimonides believes that there's no such thing as magic, and anything that the Torah describes as certain types of magic, the Torah says don't follow the magicians. It's not that they have any actual power or they have any actual influence. It's just that it was all sleight of hand. And but other people said are more open to the paranormal. So it depends which perspective you want to follow. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Good morning, Rabbi. Just to push back a little, isn't this a little beneath, God to engage in paranormal activity and magic tricks? And I mean, this is the creator of the universe and the God more of nature. So to get into to the whole of magic tricks, aren't we dumbing down the process here?
Yeah, so I would say two things. First thing I would say is that rule number one of public speaking, or rule number one of engaging with people, is you have to know your audience. In other words, if God really thinks that Moshe, if God wants to get through to the people, and the people are on a level that they are maybe not as sophisticated as that can respond to philosophical points. So maybe that's the lesson. Lesson is you have to lower yourself down to your students, to your children, to whoever. People are not on your level, and you have to find ways to communicate with them in ways that speak to them and are relevant to them, even if to you it's not the most important point, right? In other words, you see the deeper point, right? For example, there's so many examples of this where you could say, you tell your child whatever. In other words, you're not giving them the full benefit of the concept because they don't appreciate it, right? So you say, oh, if you practice reading, I'll buy you a gift. Okay, you don't necessarily tell them you practice reading, you'll be able to open up all potential for education, and you'll be able to grow, able to understand and read on your own and spread your wings, because the child doesn't understand it. So you dumb it down. And sometimes you tell somebody, do a mitzvah. Why should I do a mitzvah? Oh, because it feels good. Well, you're not giving the full philosophy behind it, right? Because the person is not ready to receive it at that point. So maybe that itself is the question. I think the question is the answer. The question is it below God? Of course it's below God, but we have to communicate with the people. That's one answer. Another answer is, and that is why I think one of the reasons why the commentaries are saying that it's not a magic trick, it's a sign. In other words, there's a philosophical point that Moshe is resisting to, and God is addressing it. And the sign is only a physical manifestation of the message that God wants to convey. And that pattern you'll see later also in the prophets, where God will tell the prophet to do a certain act and then say, oh, what does this act represent? Especially it's common with the later prophets. Do a certain act and then say, what does this act represent? And then God would say what the act represents, right? So in other words, in a way, by doing something tangible, you are making the theoretical point, you bring it into the concrete, into the practical world. So you're right. In other words, what your question may also be one of the reasons why the commentaries are insisting that it's more than just a magic trick, but it's addressing a important philosophical point, and it's just the trick is just the sign, in other words, the manifestation of that deeper truth in the physical world.
And in your first part of your answer, who exactly is his audience? The Jews or the Egyptians or both?
At this point, I believe it's the Jews, because Moshe, it happens to be, I think he does some of the signs before Pharaoh. He does other signs before Pharaoh. But here it's the people. It's clearly the people. If you look at, why did I close the screen? I don't know. Give me a second. Both Moshe's resistance is where Moshe says, the people are not going to believe me. And also I believe, unless I'm dreaming, that in verse 8, it's going to say, let me share the screen so you know I'm not just telling you stories and spinning tales. Maybe I am. We'll see. We'll find out. If you look at verse 8, it's going to say, oh, no, it's clear, right? If you look, for example, 8, in verse 5, in order that they believe that the Lord, the God of their forefathers, has appeared to you, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. So it's clearly the audience is the Jewish people. And then also in verse, so it's clearly the audience, the Jewish people. There's other resistances that Moshe doesn't want to go because of Pharaoh, right? That may be the resistance in verse 10, which says, I'm not a man of words. If the Jewish people believe you, why do you have to be a man of words? Oh, because I have to communicate to Pharaoh. So there are other forms of the resistance that relate to the Pharaoh, but specifically these signs, right at the beginning in verse 1, he says, Moses answered and said, behold, they will not believe me, and they will not, you're saying that doesn't necessarily mean the Jews. It could be the Egyptians.
Correct.
Okay, that's good. You can see.
And maybe it's both audiences.
Maybe it's both. But I think that it's a continuation. You see, the breaking of the chapters that we have is not the traditional breaking. That's sort of the Christian breaking. So if you go back even to chapter 3, it continues. You're going to come to the elders of the Jewish people. No. gather the Jewish people. Yeah, so it's not clear. Maybe it's not clear, but I would say I would be very comfortable in saying clearly the audience is the Jews. I think especially because of verse 5, right? He says, in order that they believe that the Lord, the God of their forefathers. So it has to be that forefathers. This clearly verse 5 cannot be referring. I don't think verse 5 can be referring to the Egyptians. I would say verse 5 is referring to the Jewish people. But remember, the Jewish people, they're not necessarily open to philosophical points or philosophical arguments. They're enslaved, and they are don't have the peace of mind to start debating philosophy. So maybe you have to grab their attention with a sign. So that's the first point. You have to believe them. So you do something, and remember, there's a broader point that Maimonides talks about. And Maimonides says, when Maimonides talks about this whole story, Maimonides' perspective is as follows. He basically says that Moshe, the resistance of Moshe is, just like it says over here, that he's afraid that people are not going to believe him. And God says, God gives signs. So what Maimonides says is that Moshe is not interested in signs, because he feels that if you believe the prophet because the prophet performed a magic trick, you don't have certainty that he is authentic. Because just because he can perform a magic trick, it doesn't mean that God spoke to him. Maybe he's just a good magician. Okay, so according to Maimonides, Moshe is not really satisfied with the signs, and basically Maimonides says that what gets Moshe, God's response, even though in the story it's not so chronologically arranged, but the response is what God told Moshe earlier, which is when you'll take the people out of Egypt, they'll serve God on this mountain. In other words, the Jewish people will have certainty in the prophecy of Moshe only at Sinai, when they themselves will experience the prophecy with Moses, when they will hear God speaking to Moses, the Ten Commandments. That's when they'll know for sure that Moshe is a prophet, because they'll see it by their own experience. So if you're going to take Maimonides' perspective, what that tells you is that this magic trick is to catch their attention temporarily, right? It's not really going to do the trick. It's not really going to convince people that Moshe is saying the truth, but it's enough to get their attention to follow him to Sinai. And at Sinai, that's when they will be certain. But you can't be certain based on signs. And that's why, and that's Maimonides' reading. And then I think that's consistent with what you're saying, is that this is beneath. This is a sign, a magic trick. That's what's at stake. That's how we're going to convince the people this is true. And the answer is no, but that's how we're going to catch their attention, if you want to take that perspective. But again, this is leading into, even if you say you need a magic trick, why these tricks? What's unique about these signs? And again, so that leads the commentaries to point out, to look for, again, some may be more convincing than others, but we have to look at the various perspectives. I don't know if we'll get 1 or 2 or 3, we'll see. But the point here is we're going to look for things to show what do these signs represent.
Question.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be fair to state that using the term magic is not really applicable?
Correct.
Because magic is a technique,
Right.
that one person can teach to another person to do. This is an act of God.
Right. But the point is, it's not act of God, but it's not an act of revelation. It's not prophecy. It's not that what Jewish people got at Sinai, that they felt God communicating to them, just like the prophet gets, what Moshe gets.
But the staff and the snake.
Yeah, but it's a sign. It's a sign. Yeah, it's God intervening, but
It's not magic.
it's not magic. You know that because you read the Bible. But for the audience, for the Jewish people, maybe this is a trick. And the Egyptians had tricks. The Egyptians, we'll read later, when Moshe gets his staff when Moshe turns his staff into a snake, the Egyptians do the same. Now, did they really do it, or was it sleight of hand? And so there's different opinions. I could talk about that verse. It's a fascinating verse. It's possible that, yeah, there's a verse there that says Balatehem. Balatehem means translated usually as their tricks. But some commentaries say lahat could be flame, like the flame jumping up and down. And what they say is that this room where the showdown happens in Moshe and the magicians is a dark room, and there's torches. So the light is moving. So when the light is moving, it's hard to exactly see what's happening. So the snakes, they could be there. The staff is really a staff, and the snake is in the staff. And then when you throw the staff down, the snake comes out. and then appears that your staff turns into a snake. So, but the point is, the way they did it is with the moving lights. So, in other words, with the lights is a slide. It helps the sleight of hand. So that's one way to look at it. But the bottom line is, this is not a active revelation where the God speaks to the people the way he spoke to Moses, or the way he'll speak to people at Sinai. Instead, it's a trick. You think you know it's not a trick because God said it, but maybe it's a trick. In other words, it's not on the level of communicating a intellectual point or convincing the people of a certain truth. Right? I must be truth because I can do this. I can do this. Call it trick, call it magic, call it sign. So Bob is saying, and according to Maimonides, Moshe is also saying, this is not on the level that's really going to persuade people, right? Because they can always doubt. Maybe it was magic. Maybe it was sleight of hand. Maybe it was trick. Maybe you had Kool-Aid in the cup and you poured the water and it turned red, right? We do all those tricks. I could do those tricks. I could turn water to blood. You put the Kool-Aid in the bottom of the cup and you put it in the water and it turns blood, right? A good trick. So is this really what's going to persuade the people? So Maimonides' answer is no. It's just temporary. They're not on the level yet for direct communication from Hashem. But it's enough to get their attention. Say, oh, this guy something, this guy has certain powers. But again, what I'm pushing toward is that various commentaries are saying, if God is giving these signs, then you have to say these signs have to be addressing Moshe's the resistance. What is the resistance? He thinks the people are not going to believe him. Why won't the people believe him? Maybe these signs are addressing those points. So that's what we want to do in the few minutes that remain. If we do this, at least one or two commentaries, then that would be a good day. And if it's a good day, it's going to be a good week, because there's no better way to start the week, right? Okay. Okay, the first interpretation I'm going to explain is I like the first interpretation very much. The problem is I like him on the first two. I don't know that the third one is so convincing, but I like him on the first two. But the first two, it's interesting that one way to think about it, it's almost clear that the first two are a unit. In other words, the first two are connected. The third one is separate. Why am I saying that? Because if you look at the verses, if you look at specifically, what verse am I talking about? If you look at 8 and 9, it will come to pass that if they do not believe you, and they will not heed the voice of the first sign, they will believe the voice of the last sign. I guess maybe not. Maybe it's the same. And it will come to pass that they do not believe either of these two signs, they do not heed your voice. You shall take the water of the Nile and spill it up on the dry land. Okay. Maybe what I'm saying is wrong. Okay, maybe all three are the same level. Okay, fine. Let's start. This commentary comes from this commentary that I'm going to say right now. It comes from Ha'amek Davar, which is 19th century commentator, Rabbi Yehuda Tzvi Berlin. He was the head of the yeshiva in Volozhin, and he wrote a commentary on the Chumash, very creative. Here's what he says. He says, the people, Moshe's claim, right? If you look at the verse, and say Moshe is going to say, verse 1, Moses answered and said, behold, they will not believe me, for they will not heed my voice, but they will say, the Lord has not appeared to you. Verse 4, chapter 4, verse 1. What is their resistance? God did not appear to Moses. Why not? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. So you could read anything into this statement. But the people, Moshe feels that the people are not going to believe, and they're going to say, the Lord has not appeared to you. Why not? So there could be all kinds of different interpretations. Because the Lord doesn't appear to people? No. So the Netziv, they used to call him the Netziv. Netziv is this acronym. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. The Netziv, by the way, the Bar Ilan University was started by his grandson, Meir Bar Ilan. But Bar Ilan was the modern interpretation of the word Berlin, the last name Berlin. So in other words, okay, so what does the Netziv say? The Netziv says as follows. What Moshe is saying, they're not going to believe that God appeared to Moses. Why not? Because what are they going to say? if you're the Jewish people and you have prominent Jewish people in your midst, you have the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi, you had Amram, Moshe's father. And Amram's oldest son was Aaron. And these are the people that we knew. They're the prominent Jews. They're from the prominent families. Then you hear this Moshe. Where's Moshe? Who's Moshe? Moshe, even if they knew he's from that family, Moshe grew up in the Egyptian palace. He looks like an Egyptian prince. He was away from the Jewish people. He was in Midian away for many decades, according to the Medrash, 40 years or 80 years. He shows up. They're going to say, if God wants to send the leader of the Jewish people, you're the last guy to be nominated. Why would God be the one to take you? Why you? And not someone from our midst. And even if it's, you want to say that from that same family, it should be Amram, Moshe's father, or it should be Aaron, or other elders of the Jewish people. But why Moshe? Moshe did not grow up amongst us. It's like parachuting in somebody from outside. You have the problem. I forget the name, but there's a name that when people move to a district, right before the election, right? The other people do it. Now I hear, I don't want to get political, but I hear that the questioning, maybe Governor Cuomo, who wants to run as the mayor of New York City, maybe he parachuted in from Westchester County to go to live in New York City. But it's an issue.
Carpetbagger.
What is that?
Carpetbagger.
Carpetbagger. Yeah, Moshe's a carpetbagger. He shows up. He wants to lead the people. Where have you been told now? Okay, so according to the Netziv, that's the resistance. The resistance is the people say, not that they don't believe that God wants to help them, not that they don't believe that God cannot speak to a person, not that they don't believe that God will help them, but what are they going to say? The end of verse 1, Lo nirah elecha Hashem. God did not appear to you. You're a fraud. You don't belong here. You're not a mayor. You're not a leader. We don't know who you are. I mean, we know your lineage, but you don't belong here. You're not one of us. So that is the resistance according to one perspective. Later we'll see the other perspectives. How do these signs address? So very, very briefly, if you look at the signs, what's happening here is, let me just make sure I'm saying what the Netziv says right, but if I remember say from memory, then I'll double check. From memory, you talk about a staff. Staff represents what gives a person support, okay? In this story, once you have the staff here, once the staff becomes a snake, God says, grab the tail of the snake, and that will become a staff, that will become support. So, in other words, what Moshe is saying, what God could make, what is this imagery? The imagery is that the staff, the support, comes from the most unlikely of places, right? The snake is actually the enemy of the human being. That's what God tells Adam and Eve, way back in the story of the tree of knowledge, that the Eva Ashit, God will put hate between man and snake, right? Snake, you don't cultivate a snake. Snake is the ultimate symbol of the battle with the human being, battle against the human being. And here you're going to say the snake becomes support, not just the snake, but the lower part of the snake. There's navo, the tail, the lowest part becomes the support. So what's God saying? God will provide support, not where you expect it, but in the unexpected. And the unexpected could be someone who wasn't amongst the Jewish people, who's not known to be a leader of the Jewish people, who could have been elsewhere, happens to be Moses. In other words, the support, what's the symbol? The symbol is that the support for the Jewish people does not come necessarily in the most expected of places. And it could come from the lowest place. So what are you going to say? You're at the lowest level? Okay, doesn't matter. The lowest level could become the support. That is one point. That's the first sign. Let me just go through all three, and then you'll tell me if you liked it, if you don't like it. The next thing he says, this is a practical perspective. The transformation has to happen when the hand is covered in the second sign. He puts his hand, a very important part of the story is he says, put your hand in your bosom, in other words, cover it. And then he takes it out, then it becomes leprosy, and then he puts it back, and then it becomes healthy. The point here is that the transformation happens when he's covered. It says the Netziv, the transformation of Moshe to prophet cannot happen when he's amongst his people. And this would be the problem. And what he says is like this. He says, if Moshe grew up amongst the Jewish people, and they knew him and they watched him grow up, And then he shows up as the prophet. People are going to say, how could this guy be the prophet? We know who he is. We watched him play in the sandbox. We saw him growing up. There's no way that this person could achieve such extraordinary levels of revelation. So in a way, the leader has to be separate and apart, because the transformation can't come in the open. That's what he says. And that's why Aaron cannot do it. That's why the leaders of the Jewish people cannot do it. So this is the signaling. The signaling is that you cannot be amongst, it's very hard for people to accept leadership from people that they're close to and they grew up in their midst. It's very difficult. And according to the Netziv, that's the second sign. The transformation has to come when he's not there. Says the Netziv, what's the third sign? Third sign is the blood. So blood is a metaphor for punishment, because that's what's going to happen later, the 10 plagues. And that's indeed, Moshe says, ultimately, there are going to be people who don't believe in Pharaoh, in Moshe, and they won't follow Moshe into the desert, and they're going to be punished with the Egyptians. Because everyone knows the Medrash, that not all the Jewish people left, and some of the Jewish people died during the ninth plague of darkness. So Moshe is saying the people are not going to believe me, because they're going to say God would not appear to you. So God makes the magic trick to get everyone's attention. But what's behind, not magic trick, the trick to get everyone, the sign to get everyone's attention. But what's the signaling? What's the messaging of this sign? It's not just a random sign. There's a messaging here. What's the messaging? Sign number one. The staff, the support to the people does not come from the expected places. It can come from unexpected places. It can come not from the head, but from the tail. It can come not from the leaders of the Jewish people, but from someone who the Jewish people thought was on a low level because it didn't grow up in their midst. Point number one. Point number two, transformation has to happen in concealment. You cannot lead the people that you grew up with. They'll never have that respect that is necessary for them to follow you into the desert. Right? They say you can't be a rabbi for your own family. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. And then the third one is the people who will not believe you, because again, it's Moshe's point, there'll be resistance. So he says, yeah, they're going to be people who are not going to believe you, and they're going to be struck with the Egyptians, and that's the symbol of the third one. So that's the Netziv, and I like it. I just don't like the third one because it's a little bit negative. So we could, if you have any comments or questions on this one, I'm happy to hear. Otherwise, we can go to other interpretations of these three signs, so you get at least two ways of looking at it. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, relative to your comment about blood being metaphorical and punishment,
Yeah,
blood is also represented in life.
correct. Blood is life, and that's why blood has that double messaging, and especially you see it at the 10th plague, where we put the blood on the doorposts, and that's where we get the name for Passover, and that is a sign of protection. So blood, and also we're going to start in the book of Leviticus, where you pour the blood on the altar, right? So blood is life, and blood is a sign of life. But blood has a double meaning. That blood is also the symbol for spilling the blood is a symbol for death. And if you think about the context of, if I tell someone 10 plagues, wait, is the wind or something?
No, it's
Oh, what?
a lot.
Oh, are you doing signs? Are you performing signs here, Steve?
Not me.
Oh, what was I saying? I was saying, so if you talk about the plagues, the first plague of the 10 plagues is blood, the plague of blood. So in the context of the story, if I tell you, if you didn't know, if I tell you, what do you think about water turning to blood? What imagery does that create within you? What does that awaken? Say, that's the 10 plagues, right? So in a way, we're saying this is the 10 plagues, but it's responding to the context of what Moshe is saying, is that the Jews will not believe me, says the Netziv. Some Jews will not believe, and indeed, they're not going to get salvation. They're going to be struck in the 10 plagues. So that's his perspective. That's not the only perspective. We'll do Kli Yakar, a little bit more positive, but I like the beginning. I like the first two. The first two are nice. That the fact is that the resistance is not that they don't believe that God will send a prophet, but they don't think that this person is the right guy.
Maybe aside from his speech deficiency, which of course we can go back.
Which he's addressing that in verse 10. Yeah, that's a separate issue.
We go back to what
Yeah.
he put in his mouth.
Right, the Medrash. Right.
But it also his physical stature. One may think that you would expect a very imposing
Right,
person.
right.
And Moses was not, he was short.
Yeah, so he's not the guy that you would expect. He's not the guy that you would expect.
Correct.
And for whatever reason, both because of his physical impediments and but also because of who he grew up. He didn't grow up amongst the Jews. You're the leader of the Jews. Of all the Jews, you're the one that God will choose. You happen to be a biological Jew, but you didn't grow up amongst us. You don't know our pain. You don't know you weren't here in our suffering, and now you want to come and get the glory, right? But in a way, the whole point of the sign is to be someone that people could follow. What Moshe, what the Netziv is saying for 2 points. First of all, yes, it's not about the person; it's about the fact that God shows them. So it doesn't have to be the person that you expect, right? The staff, the support can come from unexpected places. That's sign number one. Sign number two is okay. So if it can be anybody, why him? Why specifically him? Why the guy who wasn't here? Answer: because he wasn't here. Right? It's very hard for people to follow someone that they grew up with. That's what the Netziv says. And he says the moment of transformation happens in concealment. You know, you have a person that could be the greatest expert in the world. But when he comes home, his mother's telling him what to do, even in his own field. His mother's could be the biggest surgeon in the world. His mother said, yeah, chicken soup. Oh, what do you know? You're going to tell this guy knows everything that's ever written about medicine. Yeah, but because she changed your Pampers, she always thinks she knows better than you. That's just the way it works. You can't have that awe to someone who you grew up with in the sandbox. So that's the second point of the Netziv, which is the transformation cannot happen in the open. It has to be person goes away for a time. Person goes and separates himself from whatever he's doing. So the point is the fact that he's away is maybe a reason to be selected, because otherwise it doesn't work. So it's a very psychological point. But maybe it's not fear, but that's the way life is, you know? So that's the Netziv's second point. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have a quick question about the audience with the snake, with the first sign. Moses fled from it, right? It doesn't say that he was afraid, maybe
So,
right? So the audience may be Moses as well, because it's his faith, it's his trust. For the first try, he's grabbing the...
very good point. Very good point. Very good point. So the next interpretation of the Kli Yakar is going to address the fleeing more directly. But even here, when Moshe is saying they're not going to believe me, you know, he's projecting. I also don't believe. Why? I don't believe that you're choosing me. Why? I'm not one of them. You know, in other words, that same resistance that the people are saying. Why was this guy chosen? He didn't grow up amongst them. Maybe Moshe has that same resistance to himself. He says, why are you choosing me? I'm not part of them. I don't want to just show up and carpet bag into this situation. And God says, first of all, God says, so the message is to Moshe himself. And maybe the second message is even more, I would say the second message is more subtle. Maybe the second message Moshe has to understand that the transformation has to happen when you're distant. But yes, so I agree with you that Moshe is, when Moshe says they're not going to believe me, in a way he's like, if you don't believe that they're going to believe you, they're certainly not going to believe you, right? In other words, Moshe has that same problem. He's projecting it onto them. But according to this next interpretation that I'm going to say, the Kli Yakar here, that they address the Kli Yakar puts the focus on Moshe's fear and Moshe running away as a critical point of the sign. So that would be more directly, but I take your point even for the Netziv's interpretation. Yes, I think that the messaging is first and foremost for Moshe.
Right, but he believes, but he's human, right? Instinctively he will run. He will run from the snake. So
he doesn't believe that he's worthy.
Yeah, and
he doesn't believe the power of God, right? You have to understand that when he says it's not. This is not a lack of faith in God. This is a lack of faith in himself or in the people, which is a big problem. It's a big problem. But we have to differentiate between not believing in yourself is also a sin, and not believing in your people is also a sin. So Moshe doesn't say, I don't believe in you, God. I don't believe you can do it. No, God can do it. He says, I don't believe I can do it. I don't believe the people can do it. That's the sin. Right? So that's a very important point, that the leader not believing in his people, that's a sin. You can't lead people to battle. You can't lead people to success. You can't lead people out of Egypt if you don't believe in them. And if you don't believe that they're going to believe in you. In other words, you don't believe in your power to inspire them. This is all problematic. But it's all intertwined. But it's not lack of faith in God. Everybody believes in God. Problem is that we don't believe in self. We don't
So-
believe a fellow person.
Is it fair to say that Moses doesn't believe that God believes in him?
He doesn't, at the first point, if you
At-
take it and Steve,
Or
he
if signs.
doesn't believe that God, he doesn't believe that he's worthy. He doesn't believe that he's worthy. God says, I believe in you, but we resist. We hear the words, but we resist because we feel like we're not worthy. Sometimes someone comes and say, I love you, and you don't believe them. Why? Because you don't feel that you're worthy of the love. The doctor would be here. Probably he would back me up. I'm not 100% sure, but probably he would back me up, right? It's a common thing where you don't believe that you're worthy, and therefore you don't believe what the person is telling you. And it sounds like here that Moshe is saying, God says you're the right guy, but the people are not going to think that, and that's maybe just projecting that he doesn't think that. And he's just projecting that on the people. Okay, we still have 2 minutes left. I still want to do the Kli Yakar. So the Kli Yakar says as follows. Kli Yakar says first thing as follows. According to the Kli Yakar, the problem is like this. So Kli Yakar is consistent. The Kli Yakar talks about a lot of the problem with the slavery is the infighting between the Jewish people. And like when the Jewish people, when Moshe says, we talked about this earlier, when the two Jews were fighting, and Moshe told one, why are you hitting your fellow? And they said, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Moshe said, Moshe was afraid, and he said, the matter has been known. And Rashi quotes the Medrash, he says, what is known? Moshe says, known, it's known, not that I killed the Egyptian. He wasn't afraid of that. He was afraid, now I know why the Jewish people were enslaved, because they're not worthy of redemption, because they slander each other. So Moshe is very afraid of that concept of slander. The Jewish people are infighting. You can't take the people out of Egypt as a unit, as a nation. You can't build a nation with people who are slandering each other. And in rabbinic literature, Jewish literature, in the Torah, the nachash, the snake, represents slander because it's tricky, it's sly, it doesn't directly attack you, it attacks you from the back. That's like a slandering somebody. So what happens here, the way the Kli Yakar is painting the picture, number one is you have the staff. We have staff, snake, Moshe is afraid, and the snake then becomes a staff again. What is the staff? The staff is the Jewish people in the days of the patriarchs, when the Jewish people are firm and they're connected to God. Then over time, because they're in Egypt, maybe what causes the Egypt is also the slander that Joseph speaks. If you want to go back to the origin story of the Exodus, is the infighting of the slavery is Joseph being sold as a slave. Where does that start? The verse says in the beginning of the parasha of Vayeshev, the verse says that Joseph brought the slander of the brothers to their father, right? So the whole thing starts with slander. So this idea of slander and a snake is what ultimately causes the exile. So the people move, the Jewish people come from the situation of being more like a staff to being more like a snake. And when Moshe comes in, Moshe is afraid of the snake. What does it mean he's afraid of the snake? He's afraid to try to lead people who have this slander, who are infighting. That's what he's afraid of. And that's why he doesn't, people are not going to believe me. The people are cynical. People are snake-like. And what happens is God says, grab the end of the snake. What's the end of the snake? Ultimately, for the Jewish people to be healed, they have to fall very low. And when they're at their lowest points, that's when the person hits rock bottom, that's when the healing could begin. And that's why from the end of the snake, they're going to transform back into the staff. And that's what happens in the end of the parsha, because one mystery of this parsha is that it gets better before it gets worse. That Pharaoh, at the end of the parsha, once Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, Pharaoh makes the slavery more intense. He says, stop bringing them straw.
It's worse before it gets better.
It's worse before it gets better. You have to hit rock bottom. And Moshe is saying, yeah, God is saying, yes, now that they're a snake. But when you hit the end of the snake, that's when the transformation is going to happen. So now I'm reading this quickly. We can read it inside slowly next week, but that's what the Kli Yakar says, and that's all the elements of the first one. And this fits very well because I'm doing it quickly. Maybe if you want to repeat it next week, repeat it next week. But we know in the Torah that when you talk about slander, the sin for slander is leprosy, always, right? Miriam speaks and she gets tzarat. Miriam speaks slander and she gets leprosy. And so leprosy is a sin for slander. So how does that help us? Which means that yes, first time he puts his hand in his bosom, takes out, yes, the Jewish people have tzarat, they have leprosy, but the point is the leprosy is going to be healed. The leprosy is going to be healed. Slander is going to heal, meaning the infighting is going to heal, and then they're going to be worthy of coming out of Egypt, and then they're going to believe you because everything is interconnected. Let me just look at the third one. The third one here, they're more positive because the third one here, while the Netziv said that the blood is the sign for
Punishment.
punishment for the Jews, here the blood is the punishment for the Egyptians. And he basically says the Jewish people said that God tells Abraham in the covenant between the parts that before that the Egyptians are going to be punished. The nation that enslaved them for 400 years is going to be punished, and then they're going to leave. That's the order. The nation that oppressed them God will punish, and then they're going to leave with great wealth. So Moshe is saying, Moshe is making the sign to the Jewish people that yes, the 10 plagues are coming, because the Jewish people know of this prophecy to Abraham. So they know that before they're going to leave, there's going to be punishment to the Egyptians. So if Moshe comes and says, I'm the leader, they're going to say, 1 second, you didn't check all the boxes. There's no punishment for the Egyptians yet. So the blood on the water is an indication of the first plague that's supposed to come. And that's and that checks that box. And now once the Egyptians are punished, now you'll be able to be redeemed. But give me just 1 second before I take Vicky's question, because the Kli Yakar does say what I said earlier, what I tried to say earlier. Let me just see how he does this. He says like this. Okay, I'll leave that alone for right now. Okay, the point is that it goes in order. Sign number 1 may work for itself. Sign number 1 is Moshe says, I'm afraid of the people. They're not going to believe me. They have slander amongst themselves. God says, yeah, but they're going to hit rock bottom and then they'll be healed. But the slander will stop. So the second sign is that the leprosy stops, because the leprosy is a sign for the slander. And the third one is that the punishment to the Egyptians is going to happen, and that's again a sign that the prophecy to Abraham is going to be fulfilled. Okay, so Kli Yakar does it much more poetic than I can do it. I'm happy to start next week and just read it inside following his pattern. I think it's very beautiful. Maybe we'll do that next week. But in the meantime, we're 5 minutes overtime, so those who need to go can go. Vicky, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Those signs, they do like a dress rehearsal for the plagues. So
the last one, not the first two. The first two are totally unrelated. The last one.
Yes, but it's also like wonders. It's something unexpected, something. So my question is, does it look like Hashem is doing it in stages, first to convince Moses, then Jewish people, then Egyptians? And is there any commentary on that?
Yeah, so we can talk about even the signs to the Egyptians. Who is the audience? Well, that will be in the next parsha, in Va'era, the second parsha of the book of Exodus. You get mixed messages. Sometimes it says the audience is the Egyptians. Sometimes it says the audience is the Jews.
Right.
Because
that's later. What about the
one so far? I see for the Jewish people. I don't see so much this is for the Egyptians, because Moshe is still his main resistance now, at least in this conversation, the beginning of chapter 4, as far as I can tell, is the Jewish people are not going to believe me. And right. He cannot go without the Jewish people. Now, what are the signs telling him? Even the dress rehearsal, as you put it, that the sign is a sign for the punishment to the Egyptians, but that itself is a way to persuade the Jewish people, because the Jewish people have their story, they have their tradition, what God promised Abraham, slavery for 400 years, and then punishment, and then redemption. So they're waiting for that pattern to follow. So the guy shows up and starts talking about everything right, but he's not mentioning the punishment. So they're like, he's probably not the guy. He's out of touch. He didn't grow up amongst us. He's trying to be a freedom fighter, but he doesn't know our story. Our story is that there's going to be a retribution to the Egyptians. And the point here is that Moshe says, oh, don't worry, we're signaling it's an oath, it's a sign. Sign means you're signaling something. We're signaling, yes, that's coming. Now, that also ties into later, because some people say, there's a big question, why should the Egyptians be punished? The Egyptians should be punished. God wanted them to enslave the Jews. That was part of the decree. So that's a whole nother story. But one answer is they're being punished because they made it worse at the end, right? So this is an indication of why they're making it worse at the end, so that they could be punished, right? So again, there's so many pieces in the puzzle, and everybody puts the puzzle together in a little slightly different way, which is why it's a little bit confusing, and why we have to sort of try to figure out what are the big patterns here. But one way to see this is a very important part of the story. First of all, signaling to the Jewish people that your tradition that the Egyptians are going to be struck is happening. And Moshe, even though he didn't grow up amongst them, knows about this, and that's what he's signaling. And it's also going to signal the biggest resistance to Moshe. You see, what happens is, I'm giving you a spoiler alert. What happens is Moshe comes to the people they believe. But when it gets worse, then they stop believing. Right? So Moshe is signaling now that it's going to get worse. Why? So that we can bring the 10 plagues. Because up to this point, maybe they're not worthy of the punishment. They're doing what God ordained, but God did not ordain to make it worse.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about the big picture, but for now we are concentrating on the first piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Convincing Moshe. So my question was about
Moshe that he can convince the people.
right.
Now you're looking in the psychological. You were trying to break down in that which one is it more Moshe or more the people? That I don't know. That you need a psychoanalysis to figure this out. I'm totally open to say Moshe is the main audience, but at least overtly, it's convince Moshe that you can convince the people.
Right. So yeah, thank you. My question was about the commentaries. Do they address the convincing Moshe in each of those?
At least from the Kli Yakar, I think that Moshe is the main audience, because Moshe's resistance, that he thinks it ties back into the earlier story where Moshe is afraid and says the people are not worthy. In other words, the people are not worthy. So the people are not worthy. So Moshe doesn't believe in them. So if Moshe doesn't believe in them, then they're not going to believe him. If Moshe doesn't believe it's possible, there's no way he's going to convince the people that it's possible.
He needs to believe in himself too. Thank you.
That's right. Okay, a lot more to explore, God willing, in the future weeks, in good health.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful week, wonderful day. Thank you.